The payslip arrives every fortnight. The line is familiar. You have seen it for years. Gross income, tax withheld, then superannuation, 11.5%, transferred automatically by law into an account the government tells you is yours. Most Australians have never opened the annual statement. Australia manages the third largest pension pool on earth, $3.5 trillion. The median Australian worker approaching retirement holds approximately $180,000 of it. Here is the question that gap creates. Where did the rest go? The answer is documented. It lives in Treasury submissions, Royal Commission transcripts, and Productivity Commission reports released to the public and then largely set aside. What those documents describe is not a failure, it is a feature. And by the time this investigation is complete, that payslip line will not look the same again. Here is what we found. Since the early 1980s, Australian labour productivity has grown by approximately 58%. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, have grown by approximately 26% over the same period. The gap between those two numbers, 32 percentage points, is not an anomaly in the data. It is the operating output of a system constructed in one specific year through one specific mechanism to function exactly this way. Australia built the third largest pension pool on earth by redirecting worker wage growth into financial markets. The workers who built the pool are the last to benefit from it. What follows was structured to look like protection. The mechanism works better when no one reads the fine print. Stay with it. Who decided wages should flow into financial markets instead of workers' pockets? And what year was that decision made? To understand where the missing 32 percentage points went, the superannuation system needs to be examined not as it was presented, but as it was constructed, and for whose benefit. There are two ways a government can deliver retirement security to workers. The first, a public pension funded by progressive taxation, paying a defined benefit in retirement, redistributive by design. This was the Australian model before 1983. The second, compulsory private savings, redirected through financial markets, managed by institutions that charge fees on every dollar, regardless of what those dollars return. Under this model, the worker accumulates their own retirement savings inside a system owned and operated by the financial services industry. The risk stays with the worker. The fees stay with the manager. The upside, decades of compounding capital, flows through the market. Australia chose the second model. The choice was not incidental. This has a name, though it will not appear in any superannuation brochure. We call it the super capture, and once the mechanism is understood, it appears on every payslip, in every annual statement, and in the gap between the $3.5 trillion pool and the $180,000 balance. Australia has the third largest pension pool on earth, $3.5 trillion in superannuation. The median Australian worker approaching retirement holds approximately $180,000. The gap between those two numbers is not a paradox. It is a design. The super capture charges fees on balance, not on returns. The fund profits whether the worker does or not. Once the mechanism is understood, it appears on every payslip. Here is what the super capture looks like in dollar terms. The average Australian worker will pay approximately $100,000 in superannuation fees over their working life. That figure derives from Grattan Institute modelling of fee structures across the Australian system. To be precise, that $100,000 does not represent fraud or mismanagement. It represents the ordinary, disclosed, legally compliant operating cost of a system designed to manage retirement savings, whether or not those savings grow. The fund charges a percentage of the total balance every year. When the balance grows, the fee grows with it. When the balance falls, the fee holds. The incentive structure is not aligned with the worker's retirement outcome. It is aligned with the worker's balance. Those are different things. And over 40 years of compounding, the difference is approximately $100,000 transferred from the retirement savings of an Australian worker to a financial institution the worker was required, by law, to hire. Who built this system? And why did they build it this way instead of the alternative? February 1983, the newly elected Hawke Labor government sits down with the Australian Council of Trade Unions. The ACTU is led by Bill Kelty. The government needs wage restraint. Inflation is running at 11%, the economy is fragile, and a wages breakout would destabilise the recovery. The unions hold the leverage. The negotiation produces what both sides will call a landmark agreement. It is called the Prices and Incomes Accord. The terms, in plain language: workers accept below inflation wage increases. In return, the government delivers what Treasurer Paul Keating will call the social wage, expanded Medicare, and a new mechanism for retirement savings. Workers give up wages now. They receive deferred savings later. The trade is documented in the accord text itself, in the parliamentary debates that followed, and in the Treasury briefings prepared for the Hawke Cabinet in the months prior to signing. The documentation is public. What no briefing paper modelled in 1983, what no submission anticipated, was where those deferred savings would compound for the next 4 decades. We call this the accord transfer. The mechanism worked as follows. Wages that would have flowed directly to workers were redirected into superannuation accounts. Those accounts were managed by financial institutions. Initially, industry funds co-governed by unions and employers, but increasingly retail funds owned by Australia's major banks. By 2018, the 4 major Australian banks controlled superannuation funds managing more than $570 billion in member balances. The workers had traded their wages for savings. The savings had been given to the banks. What happened inside those banks became public record not through a leak, not through investigative reporting, but through the most expensive financial inquiry in Australian history, the Royal Commission into Misconduct in the Banking, Superannuation and Financial Services Industry. Commissioner, Kenneth Hayne. Duration, 13 months. Cost to Commonwealth, $75.8 million. What the Commission documented inside Australia's superannuation system, the system built from the wages Australian workers traded away in 1983, runs to 10,000 pages of testimony and exhibits. AMP, one of Australia's largest superannuation providers, had charged fees for no service to members. In documented cases, to members who had died. The total fees for no service identified across the industry, approximately $850 million charged to approximately 300,000 accounts. AMP's chief executive resigned. AMP's chairman resigned. The documented misconduct had been ongoing in some cases for a decade before the Commission convened. In 2018, a Royal Commission found that AMP, one of Australia's largest superannuation providers, had charged fees to members who had died. The total fees for no service across the industry, $850 million, charged to 300,000 accounts. This was not a rogue operator. This was the ordinary functioning of a system built to manage retirement savings on behalf of workers who had no legal alternative but to participate. Participation was mandatory. The fees were optional. Only one of those things was enforced. 1 year after the Hayne Commission, the Productivity Commission published its own review of the superannuation system, finding 1/3 of Australian super accounts were invested in products the Commission classified as underperforming. The annual cost to members, approximately $3.8 billion in foregone returns. Retirement savings that compounded for the fund instead of the worker. The accord transfer had been designed to protect Australian workers in retirement. The system executing the transfer had been designed to serve Australian financial institutions while they got there. The super mechanism is one layer. There are 2 others operating simultaneously, in the tax system and in the ground beneath every Australian city. The super capture is the layer visible on every payslip, the mechanism that determines whether the wealth it accumulates ever becomes the house to live in. That layer operates in the tax code. 2 policies, introduced in different decades, designed publicly to encourage investment. In combination, they produce the gearing gradient. The first, negative gearing. The deduction that allows property investors to write rental losses against their income tax. Cost to the federal budget, approximately $3.9 billion per year, according to Parliamentary Budget Office analysis. The second, the capital gains tax discount, introduced in 1999, following the Ralph Review of Business Taxation. Any asset held for more than 12 months, including investment property, is taxed on only 50% of its realised gain. Cost to the federal budget, approximately $19 billion per year. Per Parliamentary Budget Office analysis, approximately 80% of that $19 billion flows to the wealthiest 20% of Australian income earners. Together, $23 billion per year in foregone federal revenue, flowing predominantly upward. Here is what the gearing gradient produces at ground level. The median Sydney house price in 2024 is approximately 13.8 times the median annual household income. In 1990, that ratio was approximately 4.5. The house did not become 3 times more expensive because it became 3 times better. It became 3 times more expensive because the tax system made it rational. More than rational, mathematically optimal, for capital to flow into existing residential property rather than into wages or productive investment. For every dollar saved toward a first home deposit, the gearing gradient adds approximately $1.40 to the price being saved toward. Australia's household debt-to-income ratio now sits at approximately 185%. among the highest of any developed economy in the OECD. That figure is not a measure of recklessness. It is a measure of what must be borrowed to access housing in a market structured to keep prices rising. And beneath the super fees, beneath the gearing gradient, beneath the debt ratio, there is a third layer, the one that operates furthest from the payslip. Australia is one of the most resource-rich nations on Earth. Iron ore, coal, lithium, natural gas, extracted from Australian ground, belonging in law to the Australian people. The royalty rates charged to extract that wealth range between 5 and 7.5% of revenue. Norway, the most comparable resource-rich comparable, captures approximately 78% of petroleum revenue for its sovereign wealth fund. The Norwegian Government Pension Fund Global holds approximately $1.7 trillion. The Australian Future Fund holds $230 billion. The difference, over $1 trillion, did not stay in the ground. It left the country. This is the royalty floor, and the attempt to raise it had a specific documented price. In May 2010, the Rudd government announced the Resources Super Profits Tax, a levy that would have raised the effective extraction rate to approximately 40% of profits. Within 8 weeks, the mining industry had committed $22 million to a public advertising campaign opposing it. By June 2010, Kevin Rudd had been replaced as Prime Minister by his own caucus. The tax was abandoned before a single parliamentary vote. A reduced version, the Minerals Resource Rent Tax, was introduced in 2012. In its first full year of operation, it collected $200 million against projected revenues of $2 billion. These mechanisms do not operate in isolation. There is a fourth layer, less visible, operating at the level of monetary policy and banking regulation. That determines who can access the assets this architecture inflated, and who carries the debt when the rate cycle turns. The next investigation maps it from the Reserve Bank boardroom to the mortgage statement. Here is the framework. Every time a headline reads, Australia's economy grew, the question to ask is grew for whom? GDP measures total output. It does not measure distribution. A country where productivity grows 58% and wages grow 26% will report strong economic growth every year, and the workers inside it will feel the gap every fortnight on the payslip line they have stopped reading. The wealth gradient, the widening distance between what Australia produces and what Australians keep, was not produced by market forces operating without design. It was produced by a sequence of documented decisions. The 1983 Accord that redirected wages into financial markets. The 1992 Superannuation Guarantee that made the redirection mandatory for every employed Australian. The 1999 CGT discount that turned residential property into the primary wealth vehicle for those who could already afford to invest. And the 2010 decision to leave the royalty floor exactly where it was. Each decision had a documented rationale. Each rationale described the mechanism as a benefit to working Australians. Each outcome transferred wealth in the same direction. The super statement most Australians have never opened contains 11.5% of every wage earned since entering the workforce. It is compounding inside a system that the Hayne Royal Commission documented charging fees to members who are no longer alive to notice. The house out of reach is priced at 13.8 times annual income because the tax code was structured to make it rational for investors to keep purchasing it. The mineral wealth extracted from Australian ground left the country at a royalty rate that Norway would classify as an administrative error. None of this is concealed. All of it is documented. The Accord text is public. The Ralph Review is public. The Hayne Commission transcript runs to 10,000 pages of public record. The Parliamentary Budget Office analysis is available on the PBO website. The Productivity Commission Superannuation Review is a 700-page public document. The mechanism functions not because it is secret. It functions because policy documents are boring. Superannuation fee schedules are boring. Royalty rate calculations are boring. The gap between what is produced and what is kept, that part is not boring. That part is a working life. Now the mechanism is visible. What this investigation mapped is the foundational layer, the architecture that redirected 4 decades of Australian productivity growth away from the workers who generated it. It does not operate alone. There is a second system, the monetary policy and banking framework that determines who can access the assets this architecture inflated, and who pays the price when the rate cycle moves. The next investigation traces that system from the Reserve Bank's inflation mandate through to the mortgage being paid, or the one that cannot be qualified for, because by the time the next rate decision is announced, the cost will already have been calculated, just not by the people paying it.